It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe Friday, March 1st, 2024, back from a week's hiatus. He is Sam Park, I am John Ramey, and we wish all of you a hearty Dobry dzień, Sam, which you will undoubtedly recognize as good day in Russian. We're going to return our focus to the murderous and expansionist autocracy of Russian dictator Vladimir Putin today, his killing of political prisoner Alexei Navalny, Europe's scramble for solutions to deter a belligerent Russia, and the threat of a Putin ally returning to the White House. Europe's scrambling for solutions. Also, the question of frozen Russian assets. Can those be legally used to help aid the Ukrainian cause? Of course, last week was the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we are now into year 3 of a major ground war in Europe. But let's start with Alexei Navalny, who was buried today, Sam.
Yes.
The New York Times, Valerie Hopkins reporting thousands of people crowded into a neighborhood on Moscow's outskirts on Friday. Today, some bearing flowers and chanting "No to War" as they tried to catch a glimpse of the funeral for Alexei Navalny. This is not normal in Russia. There have been hundreds of arrests thus far of mourners at various memorial sites since Navalny's death on February 16th.
Yes, but none at the funeral
Yes,
itself.
no widespread arrests in this one. So maybe calculation for the politically sensitive moment?
In a way, yes. And also, the funeral was taking place at a church.
Yeah.
And Putin is known to be very closely allied with the Russian Orthodox Church. I think he might have deemed it unwise to conduct a large number of arrests in that particular location.
It might be off-brand for him domestically, politically.
Yes, and the other thing is that he can sort of pretend he's not a tyrant, right? And say, okay, go ahead, have your funeral. I get it. It's a church, all right? The guy's dead. Put him in the ground, and let's move on to our regularly scheduled autocratic repression.
As Navalny's coffin was lowered into his grave, "My Way," the Frank Sinatra classic, was played. I would point out that's written by Paul Anka, but for Frank Sinatra. And then they also played the theme to Terminator 2, which Navalny claimed was like the greatest movie ever.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. That's kind of disappointing to me, but that, you know.
Well, 1 out of 2 ain't bad, but listen, I mean, the guy's a hero, right? He died while being held in a Siberian. He literally died as a political prisoner in a Siberian prison. He was in the custody of the Russian Federal Penitentiary Service. He was 47.
Yes. And he'd been not in that prison, but he'd been in prison in Russia for 3 years.
And he had survived an assassination attempt and then had returned to Russia to help lead the resistance, knowing it would likely cost him his freedom, if not his life.
That's right. I think there was some hope, perhaps not by himself, but some of his supporters seemed to think that he would be sort of a Nelson Mandela figure. And I think that was probably not the wisest hope to have.
I don't think Navalny thought that.
I don't know. That's exactly the point. I don't think he believed that. But at the same time, if he didn't believe it, he must have known that he was costing himself his own life. Because honestly, that was what I thought when he was in prison. All right, is that okay? He might, they failed to assassinate him through, various nerve agents and what have you. But once he's in prison, that's pretty much it for him. Now, here and there, other Russian opposition figures have been released. For example, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. But that was quite some time ago. And things have changed in Russia quite a lot since then. And so it seems to me that Navalny should have known that he was signing his own death warrant by returning to Russia and risking imprisonment.
That's what makes this all the more compelling.
Some people would say that, and I can understand why they would think that. I would counter, however, that there's a reason that autocrats put to death their political opponents. And that reason is because it works, right? You take the person off the table. And I think even though they did try to assassinate him, in a way, holding him in prison was better, right? Because you just sort of keep him in your pocket and you can deploy this at any time, right? For example, we mentioned Navalny's death before our previous episode 2 weeks ago, at which point the Munich Security Conference had just convened. And I believe Navalny died the night before the opening day of the Munich Security Conference. Now, John, as you might know, I find the Munich Security Conference pretty interesting, just in general, and even more so in the past couple of years. But I'm not the sort of person who's going to hunt down the advanced media materials for the Munich Security Conference.
Right, you're not reading the game notes ahead of time?
No, but the point I'm making is that I don't think Vladimir Putin would have had to deploy his intelligence services to find out that Yulia Navalnaya, now Navalny's widow, was scheduled to speak on the opening day of the conference. And so, in a way, killing Navalny at that moment sort of gave Putin himself a silent keynote slot in Munich. And now that doesn't mean he had to do it then, but things have been going.
Why then? Well, that's one good reason.
Yeah, things have been going rather well for Putin right now. His troops that had just taken Avdiivka in Ukraine, and they're, in fact, are continuing to take territory in eastern Ukraine as we speak. Our Congress can't seem to find any more aid for Ukraine. That's a win for him. And by the way, about a week before the conference, Donald Trump, on a campaign appearance, said that if any NATO, unprompted, by the way, that if any NATO ally had not contributed enough of their own GDP to their own defense spending, that Trump would not just allow someone to invade them, but in fact encourage the invader to do, as he put it, whatever the hell they want. And then just as an aside, he said, you got to pay your bills, which, first of all,
that's rich coming from him.
That's pretty rich coming from him, but that's also not how NATO works, actually.
Yeah, NATO is not a tenant in your apartment complex.
That's right. And so that was about a week before Munich, and that raised a lot of hue and cry across Europe, as you might expect. I think partly Putin might have thought, you know what? I don't want him to be the guy that everybody's talking about in Munich. I want it to be me, right? And he had the perfect way of doing that. And then once he finds out that Navalny's wife is speaking in opening day, he's like, okay, this is the time to play that card, right? Now that, I don't know that, right? But you have to admit, John, it's a pretty good story.
Yeah, it's a fine narrative and one that I'll accept, because you do wonder, like, he was in custody for 2 years?
3.
3. Why
Almost
now?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Why now? So he's 47 and he is a martyr to the cause of freedom around the world. Alexei Navalny.
Yes, but in 10 years, will people remember him a lot more than they remember someone like Boris Nemtsov, who was gunned down in front of the Kremlin, right? Or Anna Politkovskaya, who was also assassinated in 2006, and whose name
I don't know either of those. I might remember the killing at the Kremlin, but I do think the international moment is greater now because of the invasion.
I would agree with that, but at the same time, again, there's a reason you kill your opponents.
Right. Any other thoughts on Navalny, or can we pivot to the meeting of 20 European leaders in Paris to talk about what to do if a Putin ally gets into the White House, among other things?
I mean, it's not really much of a pivot. It's all the same story, right?
It is. It's insane. There's a murderous, expansionist autocrat sitting on the world's largest stockpile of nuclear arms, who seems hell-bent on testing the limits of NATO.
Yes. And
it's wild.
It
is terrifying.
It is pretty crazy. And again, those comments by Donald Trump have really lit a fire under everybody to try and figure out what they're going to do in case Trump wins and there will be no more aid for Ukraine coming from the United States, which, by the way, I'm not convinced that we'll get any aid to Ukraine this year. Never mind if Trump comes in. But that we can talk about that perhaps a little bit later today. But the biggest headline, of course, was French President Emmanuel Macron saying that we shouldn't rule out stationing NATO troops in Ukraine. And now, of course, this is a very French and especially very Macron sort of thing to say. But European leaders couldn't fall over each other fast enough to distance themselves from Macron's comments. But again, for instance, during the first Trump administration, in 2019, Macron was already using phrases like European strategic autonomy because he was a young, dynamic leader, very forward-looking and thinking. And of course, the French love to sort of cut their own path in diplomacy, even in the context of Europe and especially in the context of NATO. And so even then, he was talking about things like this. And in a way, even though other European leaders said, well, we don't really want to do things like this, but at the same time, some of them were like, okay, I can't say something like that, but I'm not actually unhappy that Manny did, right? Because he's the perfect person to do this. Again, he's French, and this is the kind of thing that they normally do. It's the kind of thing that he's done before, right? So it's not out of character for him. He is a lame duck president in his own country, but his term still lasts another 3 years. So even his own successor in his own party wouldn't necessarily have to be saddled with something like this.
Right, but he can say and do what's on his mind because
exactly
he's
right.
termed out.
And by the way, he's certainly not the only person in Europe who thinks along these lines. He's just the only one who's in a political position to be able to say so with relative impunity.
Now, maybe it's because I'm American and deterrence through strength is a concept I'm familiar with that has worked, however imperfectly. But the fact that it is not more politically popular in Europe when you think about the real possibility of the United States security blanket being severely weakened.
Okay, but it's never been especially popular in Europe, by the way.
And I understand the context, right? There have been 2 disastrous wars in the last 100 years. Like militarizing Europe is unpopular. I get it.
Yeah, and you know when the United
But
States,
things have changed, man.
Yeah, they have in some ways. But when the United States wanted to station nuclear missiles in Germany, there was enormous protests in Germany. All right, this was very controversial even then, during the time of the Soviet Union. Now, you could argue that the threat is, reconstituted today, and I would agree with that. But what I'm saying is, even in those days, that was a very serious threat. And by the way, that almost led to a second Cuban Missile Crisis, although no one knew it at the time. It only emerged later that had happened. And so I'm less surprised about this than you are, let's say.
Well, and maybe with good reason. So you sent me a fascinating segment about this conference in Paris and Macron saying no options are off the table. And then German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying, no, we're not doing that at all. Benjamin Tallis from the German Council on Foreign Affairs.
I think it was the German Center for Strategic and International Studies, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Thank you. He was great. And we'll put a link to this interview from DW, which is the English language German news outlet. He said, look, this is just this is the tip of the iceberg attached to a behind the scenes effort to create a lane or perhaps to goad Olaf Scholz, the German leader, into having a little bit of room to even entertain something that, as you have pointed out, is very traditionally politically unpopular. But Germany, although not nuclear armed, is the biggest country in Europe, is the biggest economy in Europe. So if there's going to be some strategic thinking about European security without the United States, Germany is going to have to play a part in that. And Macron knows that.
Yes. On the other hand, Germany is already the single largest European provider of military and economic aid to Ukraine, even though France has far and away the largest and most capable military in Europe. So
special circumstances, Germany.
Yeah, okay, but fine. But there's a tension here. On the mind you, in a way, it's sort of a horses for courses thing, right? Macron could say, well, we've got a larger army
and nukes.
Right? Yeah. And so we can, that's what we have is people. All right. Germany really does need to step up its industrial production of munitions and they're trying to do this, but it's taking a very, very long time.
Putting the German economy on a, quote, wartime footing, as has been used in discussions about this, is, I get it.
That's not easy to do. Yeah.
Especially after the last century.
Exactly. And one sort of, I don't want to say humorous, but let's say, unusual thing that happened, I believe a couple of weeks ago tomorrow was the president, not the prime minister, but the president of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, announced that his country had found hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition that they could ship to Ukraine very quickly. Now, that's great. I guess they were like under a tarp in his garden shed or something. Because, John, it's always the last place you look.
Right.
But this is not a macro solution. All right. Countries around Europe are going to be like, oh, look. And so,
we found extra munitions in our couch cushions.
Yeah. Now, mind you, one or two might. All right. But this is not something that we can apply across the board. Right. There needs to be better systems. And so I was heartened this week when Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, announced that Europe had agreed to joint procurement of defense assets for the first time. And this sort of followed, like, for instance, joint spending on things other than, say, agriculture in the European Union has always been viewed very skeptically because spending should be, it's thought, the province of individual member states. And so until the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was very little joint spending. That changed with COVID when COVID relief funds were jointly procured and dispersed. And that could have really changed the way the EU operates going forward. It's too early to say. But if this joint defense procurement goes through, then we would say it will have, and for very good reason, by the way. But again, the European Union is not an institution known for doing things quickly. Quite the reverse, in fact. So we'll have to see how fast this joint procurement can get off the ground and start providing aid. But the specter hanging over all of this, as we know, right, is these discussions would not be happening. Macron would not be talking about putting boots on the ground. Petr Pavel would not be finding munitions in his garden shed. Maybe Ursula von der Leyen would have gone so far as to come about with joint defense procurement for the EU. Maybe not. That is, if it were not for the failure of the United States over the course of months now to provide.
I'm going to say, you brought this up on a phone call we had yesterday. I'm going to say it's a catastrophic dereliction of duty and an abandonment of internationalism that stretches back beyond Donald Trump.
I would agree with that. And
You and I talked about this on the phone yesterday, that it starts with George W. Bush, not H.W., who was a committed internationalist.
yes,
It started with W., who was not an isolationist by any stretch, but as you said, he was a unilateralist.
yes, not an internationalist. And I think people, on the one hand, and for instance, I think that might be why this is being treated as if it's something like a routine matter, right? Because in a way,
Because Europe's had 20 years of practice of the United States not being international?
Yes. And we've sort of gotten used to that. But the point I would like to make is that this is not just about Donald Trump.
No.
And people would like to pretend that it is. And I think
it is a catastrophic dereliction of duty by one of the two major political parties.
Yes.
And it's been going on for decades.
It's been moving in this direction for decades. And now
it's all the more astounding because the Republicans were the tough internationalists. They were the hardliners.
Yes, but starting with George W. Bush, they've started to move away from that position.
Which is deeply ironic because he loved Reagan. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, but he also wasn't very bright. And by the way, he was also the first Republican president to cozy up to Vladimir Putin. And I think this is a crucial distinction to make. Yes, the Russian Federation is the successor nation of the Soviet Union. And yes, Vladimir Putin does wish to reconstitute something like the Soviet Union. However, Vladimir Putin is a figure of the right. And we need to make sure that we point this out very explicitly. For example, George W. Bush was and is an evangelical Christian, and he was the first American evangelical president since the time that evangelicals became the base of, or an important element of the base of the Republican voting public. And this is very important. Bush's first meeting with Putin took place in the summer of 2001 in Slovenia, which was then an aspiring NATO and EU member. They had yet to join, but they were in the process of doing these things. Bush had just become president earlier that year.
Is this where he stared into his eyes?
Yes. Bush had just become president earlier that year. Putin had only been president for about a year and a half. People didn't really know a lot about him. I think a lot of people looking back on it would say, okay, we probably did know enough to be suspicious of him. George W. Bush, by his own words, looked Putin in the eyes and got a sense of his soul, is how he put it. And this is, again, specifically religious terminology to say something like this. It was reported at the time that in their first conversation, Putin had spoken to Bush about God. And so...
What a breakthrough from the former godless communists.
Exactly, right? So evangelical Christians during the Cold War were opposed to the Soviet Union because they were godless. George W. Bush, the evangelical president of the Republican Party, essentially told his supporters,
these are good guys now.
These are good guys now. Now, I should say, Republicans were not the only people at that moment who thought the Russians are going to be our friends. It's the end of history, blah, blah, blah.
Listen, W. Bush's successor, Barack Obama, who you and I have admired for a long time, very clearly did not deal with the Russian question correctly. We now can see. Right.
I should
this is a bipartisan critique of American internationalism.
I should say, however, that at the time that they tried to hit the reset button, as they called it, with Russia, Putin was not president. Dmitry Medvedev was president. There was some hope that maybe there could be something of a power shift. That was a mistake, as you said.
Whatever. The annexation of the Crimean Peninsula happened. And
that's right.
And the American response was now, in retrospect, very clearly insufficient.
Yeah. And to his credit, I think George W. Bush wised up about Putin by the time he left office.
And certainly George W. Bush now, if he ever spoke on the record, would not be like in agreement with Donald Trump's assessment of Putin.
Yes, but he doesn't ever speak on the record. He has never come out and said, I was wrong about Vladimir Putin, right? Instead, he...
Has Obama?
No, I don't think so. But the point is that, as I said, Putin is a figure of the right. George W. Bush is a figure of the right. George W. Bush is an evangelical Christian. Vladimir Putin supports the
Orthodox
Russian Church very strongly. Vladimir Putin persecutes gay people very vociferously, by the way. George W. Bush campaigned for re-election on a promise to support a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. Not just legislation, mind you, not just that he himself was opposed to the idea of gay marriage. He said that he intended to enshrine marriage inequality in the founding document of our country. And so when he told his supporters that he had gotten a sense of Vladimir Putin's soul, any of those supporters who cared could have done a little research and said, wow, this guy Putin, he hates gay people just as much as I do. And so, for instance, when Donald Trump ran for president, he said things like, build the wall. And in fact, even before he started running, he first came to political attention as a fomenter of the birther conspiracy, right? Later, he wanted to ban Muslims. He did not create any of those ideas. Those were all very popular ideas on the far right, or perhaps not quite so far. Should we imagine then that his admiration for Vladimir Putin was something that he just came up with on his own? I think it's sincere, mind you, but I think he also knew that this was something that was a popular opinion on the American right already. The problem is, this is not something that any opinion poll taker would ever think to ask the American public in 2015, right? What's Vladimir Putin's approval rating amongst Americans? It just never would have occurred to them. I don't think I've still never seen an opinion poll about this taken among Americans because of a failure of imagination, I think, on the part of people who take polls. I think that had such a poll been taken 10 years ago or 9 years ago, the results would have surprised a lot of people. We'll never know the answer to this. I can't back that up, I should mention. Just along those lines.
I mean, there are people who take in this podcast who are evangelical Christians. I have friends who are evangelical Christians, right? I think it is important. I think it is important to make sure that we are being clear that this is not just two, coastal elites blaming everything on evangelical Christians. I think, however, the metastasizing of the Republican Party's twisted worldview is linked to this. And
I think so. Very dramatic.
You will see figures, plenty of figures from Tucker Carlson on down in the right-wing media ecosphere in the United States, embracing Orban, Putin. Tucker just went to interview Putin, rather embarrassingly for him.
Yes.
But that is the link, right? Ronald Reagan was and remains an iconic figure in Republican myth but Ronald Reagan held the line against Russian communism and the polar opposite of the United States and freedom and the West in the Cold War.
Yes, but he
but he had the we're defending religion as well.
He more than anyone else cemented the union of evangelical Christianity in his own party.
Right, because Jimmy Carter, an elected Democrat, was an evangelical Christian, and that was part of his base.
Yes, and in fact, Reagan, as a divorced Hollywood actor, needed to make that connection. That was not something that was actually naturally part of who he was. He had to go out and get those voters, but he did it. And there's a metaphorical construction that I'm going to employ here that might be a little controversial. But when
we're talking politics, so we're off the rails anyway.
When we talk about Donald Trump, we often say he's the first president to do this or that. He's the first president to be impeached twice. He's the first president to be indicted after he left office, for some crimes that committed while he was president, some crimes he committed after, etc. When he left office, I would say, metaphorically, mind you, that he became the second Confederate president of the United States. Now, nobody's seceding, right? States are not leaving the Union, but he represents a second nation that is opposed to the prevailing constitutional order of the United States. That second nation is not a democracy. It is a dictatorship. And it seeks to take control of the entire country, not just part of it, through the democratic process and then end that democratic process. Now, perhaps you might think this is exaggeration, and to some extent, perhaps it is. I'm just using this metaphor as a framework for broadening our understanding. I admit it's all going to hold water, right? So if we think about somebody like Mike Johnson, right, the titular Speaker of the House,
who is holding up aid to Ukraine and imperiling the Pax Americana.
Yes, right. He's not actually interested in being the Speaker of the House. He just got that job in order to get a different job in the Confederacy. That's the country he's actually working for, right? He's the denial of military aid to Ukraine is the Confederate policy of the United States because it was dictated by the leader of that nation, who is Donald Trump. And Mitch McConnell just announced he was stepping down from the Senate leadership. The New York Times reported that McConnell conceded he was out of step with the national security consensus of his own party. And
again,
so,
a disgraceful a disgraceful abdication of our duty on the world stage by the Republican Party.
But he understood that he couldn't be allowed to serve in the Confederacy, right? And so there was no
Sam, does anybody in this Republican Party, the second nation, this Confederacy, this Trumpian state, have they never read a history book? Do they not know what the 20th century was? Do they just not care? I mean, it's not like you and I hang out a bunch at Trump rallies, so I guess maybe you're the wrong person to ask.
The thing is, John, the second option you proffered there, I think, is the right one. It's that they don't care. If they
it's
have
just nihilism.
They have read the history, and it doesn't bother them. And this is look at what's happening in the Supreme Court. That the Republicans have actually been trying to do this for a very long time.
I mean, I do want to keep this internationally based. Domestic U.S. politics. I understand the Supreme Court and abortion and all this stuff, but like just from the international order, from preventing World War III, the disregard for the realities are I mean, truly, Sam, unimaginable.
I understand that, and you're right. Okay, but the fact is, the idea of the United States as an internationalist country is anomalous. It's an 80-year anomaly.
It's also essential.
Okay, fine. But prior to World War II,
Right.
Isolationism was the order of the day throughout
And
American
that's my
history.
point. I'm like, we know it doesn't work. We have a pretty good example of it not working.
But still, the United States had to be dragged into the Second World War kicking and screaming. And many people in the United States up until that time supported Hitler, or at least didn't believe he was a big problem.
Right.
And it had to be proven to them after they joined the war. They didn't even understand it until the war was over. And I think that we would be foolish to overlook these historical facts. All right. So, John, if you say, don't these people understand history? I would say, don't you?
Right. Is it Churchill who said you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all of their options?
I'm not sure.
I mean, that might be apocryphal, but
that is attributed to him. Yeah. Which is a great
and the reason we have that phrase is because there is some truth to it.
Absolutely.
So it's going to take some catastrophic thing. And the Chinese invasion of Taiwan might not even reach that bar.
Oh, I don't think so. No.
To get enough of this second America, this confederacy, on board with internationalism again.
Yes. And if there's one, I don't want to go.
Oh, it's terrifying.
I don't want to go much into the Supreme Court and things like this. But if there's one thing that we should have learned before this week, but we definitely better learn it this week, it's that it's up to us. The only safeguard we have left is the electorate. That's all. Right?
Our colleague, Tim Miller, said the exact same thing on his Bulwark podcast yesterday.
And he's not wrong. Every other institution has failed. And so maybe Tim wants to think about whether he really wants to be a classical liberal, as he seems to be dancing around with. And this whole Edmund Burke thing of, we have to filter everything through our institutions. It's like, what institutions? We don't have institutions. They are all corrupt. They have all failed. All we have is us. Edmund Burke, mad respect. Let him rest in peace. Come up with your own ideas.
So the international question, after a year and a half of this podcast, finally found its way into the American political conversation, which you and I carry on, not online. Fascinating. I guess now there's no time like the present. What are we looking at for next week?
Iran is having parliamentary elections starting today. They're not especially eventful. Somebody else is probably having another election. But all these things will continue to unfold. We'll see what happens during the week.
All right. John Ramey Media at gmail.com. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, folks.